Multilinguals of Reddit. What's your best "they had no idea I understood their language" moment? Story 1. This happened a couple of days ago. I am an American traveling abroad in the Middle East, and I went on a date with an Arab man. He asked if I spoke Arabic, but since I am not comfortable speaking it, I said no. I can understand most of it, though, and can speak if necessary. Dinner was great. We got along well, and then we went to smoke shisha at a local cafe. The owner, who was my date's friend, asked who I was in Arabic. My date smiled at me sweetly, squeezed my hand, and told his friend in Arabic, an American wuss who I am going to sleep with later. I kept a polite smile on my face. When the owner took my order, I said in Arabic, "And 1 tea for the American wuss who he will not sleep with later." The look on their faces was priceless. I ended up taking a cab home. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I am American, but my mother is Greek. She moved to the United States for college and to get far, far away from her narcissistic, hypochondriac, and misanthropic mother. When I was growing up, she did not really teach me much Greek or encourage me to learn, apparently because she did not want me to understand what her mother was saying. Yes, she is that awful. I was fluent when I was young since we spent every summer in Greece. Our whole family is there. My father was an only child, so aside from my mother's sister in Miami and her children, there was not really an American side of the family. But as I got older, I let my Greek fade because my Yaya constantly mocked me, my pronunciation, my grammar, my clothes, everything. Now I am only conversationally fluent, which is frustrating. I could be better, but I get stage fright when speaking with other Greeks because, in the back of my mind, I assume they are judging me as harshly as she did. At least my pronunciation is solid. Because of this, for a long stretch, from about age 9 to 19, she did not really think I spoke Greek, especially since I avoided speaking around her. I played ignorant and tuned her out, just so I would not have to engage with her constant negativity. This is a woman who does not smile unless she is mocking someone. She once taunted her 4-year-old granddaughter with lukumades until the child cried, then refused to give her any simply because she dislikes my uncle's wife. One summer at their beach house, I was having lunch with Yaya, my aunt from Miami, and her children. I was sitting there in my swimsuit and towel since I was leaving right after. As usual, Yaya started talking trash, this time about me, all because I was drinking a Fanta. That was all it took. Of course, she was not speaking to me directly. She aimed it at my aunt, who often acted like her crony. I had a feeling my aunt suspected I understood more Greek than I let on, and I caught her giving me side-eye while Yaya kept going, clearly trying to gauge my reaction. I gave her nothing. Yaya went on about how I looked better than before, but that I was kind of fat, which was hilarious considering I have always been athletic, and this was the obese pot calling the kettle black. She said I would get really fat if I kept eating the way I did, especially since I was drinking soda. Screw you, lady. It was 3 in the afternoon, and that Fanta was literally my breakfast. Besides, I spent 5 hours a day snorkeling, so I was more than working it off. She kept finding other things to mock, and I just took out my frustration on every bite of food. I ignored her and turned my attention to my cousins beside me. We spoke in English, since most of us grew up in the States, except for the ones born and raised in Greece. For the record, the Miami cousins do not think Yaya is mean, probably because their mother is exactly the same. When I finished my meal, I tossed my empty Fanta can and finally snapped. In Greek, I told her I was not going to get fat and that she was being mean. For a moment, she looked shocked, then angry. She shot back something along the lines of, "I knew you could understand us." I do not remember her exact words, since it has been a while. After that, I stopped going to lunch at her house. Now she barely speaks to me, except to make me work in the garden, which, honestly, I enjoy. She does not invite me over, does not initiate conversation at all. Kind of worth it. My papo, on the other hand, is such a kind person. That is the only reason I did not really go off on Yaya, and did not want to risk being cut off from him. These days, I eat with my uncle and his wife, whom Yaya cannot stand, so she talks to me even less. It stings because my father's parents were never part of my life, and now both my grandmother and my father are gone. All I have left is my Greek family. The truth is, I do not like my Yaya at all. I only care about my papo, but unfortunately, being around her is the price I have to pay to spend time with him. Story 3. Being a tourist. Honestly, unless you are a seasoned international traveler, it is nearly impossible to leave your country and not look like one. Even then, it is tough. I have heard stories of people living abroad long enough to become fluent in the local language, yet others still treat them like tourists. I know a couple who have lived on Hispaniola for about 20 years. They have learned not one but 2 languages there, Spanish and Haitian Creole, and still, until they actually start a conversation, they look like tourists. If you want to avoid being targeted by pickpockets, do not wear brand new clothes. Shorts are fine if locals wear them. Some places are hot, and shorts are normal, but choose ones that look worn in, with a paint splatter or a stain, something clearly not fresh from the store. Avoid anything that advertises the place you are visiting or something you just bought there. For example, if you are in Puerto Rico, do not wear a shirt that says Puerto Rico or the name of a local spot. Even then, you will still stand out as a tourist. You will not know the local mannerisms, and even if you speak the language, your accent, small grammar mistakes, or even speaking too perfectly will give you away. It is extremely difficult to travel somewhere with a different language and blend in completely. As for souvenirs, wait until the end of your trip. Buying them early just shows you have money with you to spend on unnecessary items. It also means you are carrying more stuff around and are less likely to notice your wallet missing. When it comes to where you spend your time, avoid the major crowded tourist traps. If you cannot walk without bumping into people, you can bet pickpockets are there. At the same time, and I know this sounds contradictory, do not wander into places that are completely off the tourist path unless you are in a decent-sized group or with a truly trustworthy guide, not someone you just met while traveling. While those areas usually do not have pickpockets, you are far more vulnerable to bigger risks, like being robbed. For general safety, do not carry more cash than you can afford to lose. ATM fees might be annoying, but they are better than risking hundreds of dollars or your safety by carrying too much cash. Unless you are certain your accommodations are secure, keep your ID on you at all times. It is also smart to have a backup ID and a scanned copy of your passport stored separately. Yes, some of this may look touristy, but honestly, you are going to look like a tourist anyway. Lanyards worn under your shirt to hold your passport are probably the safest option, and you can keep cash there as well. If you do not use a lanyard, keep your ID in a front pocket and always keep a hand on it. Back pockets are easy targets for pickpockets. It is much less risky to have it somewhere you can guard. After all, why make it easy for someone to reach in when most people leave wallets in back pockets with their hands full? Source: I travel internationally frequently, both on mission trips and for fun. Even after years of traveling, mostly to Spanish-speaking countries, a language I am approaching fluency in, I still stand out as a tourist, even in areas with fair-skinned locals. I have spent time in various slums and prisons, so I have learned how to protect my belongings and myself. That said, most people everywhere are decent. The reality is simply that being a tourist naturally attracts those who are not. TLDR, unless you are traveling within Europe, and even then, it is hard not to look like a tourist. If you are not a very experienced traveler, accept that it is almost impossible. Do not dress up, it makes you a target. Carry only as much cash as you can afford to lose. Buy souvenirs at the end of your trip. Passport necklaces may look touristy but tucked under your shirt. They are fairly secure. If you do not use one, keep a hand on your passport at all times. Avoid large crowds and stay with people you know. Story 4. Well, I hope I do not come across as super pedantic, but there are a few misunderstandings I would like to clear up. It seems strange that we have two such remarkably similar languages. It is true that as Romance languages, they are quite similar. That said, they belong to separate branches of the Romance family, and compared to other Romance languages, they actually differ quite a bit. Grammatically and lexically, Italian and French share more in common with each other than either does with Spanish. The reason Italian and Spanish are often perceived as closer is that their phonologies are superficially similar, so cognates often sound alike. By contrast, French cognates can be harder to recognize for Italian speakers because the phonological differences make comprehension more difficult. Even so, while basic cognates between the two are often easily understood, though not always, there are significant structural differences that make anything beyond basic communication difficult. For example, Spanish hacer and Italian fare both come from the Latin facere, yet their usage and grammar diverge considerably. By comparison, Portuguese and Spanish speakers can generally understand each other with much less effort, despite Portuguese having a more complex phonology. It is no wonder people frequently mix these languages up. Firstly, this issue only affects non-native learners of both languages. Native and non-native languages are stored in separate areas of the brain, so Spanish speakers learning Italian, or vice versa, do not typically confuse the two. Italians will not start replacing come with como just because they have been speaking a lot of Spanish. As a non-native speaker of both languages, however, I do experience this confusion. That said, while similarity between the languages contributes, it is not the main factor. The main reason is that speakers of multiple second languages tend to mix them up if one is used more frequently than the other. This happens even with completely unrelated languages. For example, a student of Japanese who moves to Germany might accidentally drop German words into their Japanese conversations, while the other is pretty much exclusively used by a single small country. While Spanish, being the second most natively spoken and the fourth most spoken language in the world, is much larger than Italian, this is somewhat exaggerated. Of the world's 6,000-plus languages, Italian ranks 18th in number of speakers and is spoken in more places than just Italy. It is not going anywhere. I feel like Italy should just give up and adopt Spanish as its language. Finally, I hope you reconsider this attitude, not for Italy's sake, because even if there were a desire to do so, it is simply not feasible given the size of the country. But these kinds of attitudes are incredibly damaging to the world's minority languages that are genuinely at risk. Italy itself is home to many minority languages: Sicilian, Napolitano, Sardinian, Lombard, Emiliano-Romagnolo, and others that are under serious pressure from Standard Italian and could disappear if support is not maintained. The same is true for the vast majority of the world's languages. As linguist Ken Hale put it, languages embody the intellectual wealth of the people that speak them. Losing any one of them is like dropping a bomb on the Louvre. Languages are deeply entwined with culture, and their value cannot be ignored. I am currently living in Catalonia, where there is a strong nationalist movement. It is easy, as you did, to dismiss interest in maintaining the language as mere nationalism, but that could not be further from the truth. In the case of minority languages, maintaining them is worth the resources, just as it is worth the effort to preserve priceless works of art or ancient structures built by our ancestors. There is also a highly practical side to it. Science shows that bilingualism provides enormous cognitive benefits. People who speak at least two languages perform better on certain intellectual tasks, particularly those involving multitasking, and they develop dementia an average of 5 years later than monolinguals. Additionally, bilingual individuals learn additional languages far more easily than monolinguals. In effect, speakers of both a majority and a minority language enjoy a significant advantage over those who speak only the majority language. Story 5. My ex is half Mexican and half American. Her grandmother is fully Mexican and does not speak any English. Her mother is fluent in both English and Spanish, grew up in Mexico, and has spent most of her life in the United States. My ex knew a fair amount of Spanish, but she had largely adopted American culture, having lived in the U.S. her whole life. Even so, Mexican culture was always present in her household. I am fluent in Spanish and spent almost my entire childhood immersed in Hispanic culture, but I had not told her about it. I do not look like someone who speaks any language other than English, so I guess she never thought to ask. She did not talk much about her family, and I did not bring it up either. When I first went to her house, I was surprised that we both grew up with a Mexican-American cultural mix, and neither of us knew we had that in common. I was just about to comment on it when her mom turned to my ex and told her in Spanish to clean up her messy laundry and put it in a closet or something, since I was there and she wanted the place tidy. Then her mom turned to me, welcomed me into her home, and smiled in a reassuring, "Don't worry about it" way. I was clearly not meant to understand, so I said nothing and pretended I had not caught it. I soon realized I had been given a lovely opportunity and continued not to mention that I spoke Spanish. Whenever they wanted to say something they did not want me to hear, they would switch to Spanish. For a few months, I listened quietly, never reacting or questioning what was being said. I heard a wide range of things, from requests for my ex to do something, to opinions about me, to comments on some of my actions. None of it was ever terrible or anything I was not meant to hear, so I continued keeping quiet about my fluency. Then one day, there was going to be a big family party, and of course, I was invited. This was when I first met my ex-grandmother. The introduction went something like this. "Intercy. This is my grandmother," my ex said, gesturing toward her. "Hello, my name is Intercy. It is nice to meet you," I replied, smiling politely. The grandmother stared at me blankly. "Oh, sorry, she only speaks Spanish," my ex explained, glancing at her grandmother. I turned to her grandmother and said in Spanish, "Sorry about that. I'll speak in Spanish. My name is Intercy. It is nice to meet you," keeping my tone friendly. Her grandmother gave a short but polite response, something along the lines of, "You too." In the next few seconds, a lot happened. My ex and her mom both turned to me, their faces full of confusion. Then they looked at each other, and I could see the realization dawning on them that I had understood everything they had not wanted me to hear for months. Her mom turned to my ex and asked, "Why did you never tell me that Intercy speaks Spanish?" My ex immediately looked at me and asked, "Why did you never mention it?" I grinned and replied, "No one ever asked. You just assumed I did not know." They were surprised and a little embarrassed, but no one was angry. It was actually kind of funny. After that, whenever they wanted to say something without me hearing, they did it the old-fashioned way. They simply left the room. Story 6. I am not fluent in Mandarin, but I am fluent enough to hold my own in a conversation and survive in China. A couple of years ago, I was in China meeting with potential manufacturers. I am a tall white Canadian, but many locals automatically assumed I was American. Unfortunately, some of the factories I visited had had negative experiences with American businessmen in the past. Given that, they also assumed I could not speak or understand Mandarin. On top of that, I was younger than the average businessman at the time, so many were not sure whether to take me seriously. While this led to a number of funny or interesting moments, there is one that has always stood out to me. This one manufacturer I was meeting with clearly had some really bad experiences with Americans in the past. As soon as I stepped into the factory and met the welcoming party, I could hear one of the upper management guys trash-talking me to his buddy, affectionately calling me the American a-hole. We went on the usual factory tour, and all the while I listened to him and the factory foreman running their mouths in Mandarin about the many ways they planned to mess with me, and how I was a rich kid who had no idea what I was getting into. I kept a friendly smile plastered on my face and pretended I had no idea what they were saying. We wrapped up the tour in the boardroom to talk numbers. The crap talker had the nerve to say, "This guy is going to pay through the nose." I am paraphrasing since I can't recall the exact Chinese euphemism. When I asked how much they could make my part for, they said they needed a moment to discuss. The team huddled at one end of the table, and I overheard one guy say, "We can outsource this to the other manufacturer I am meeting with in the afternoon. They can make it better and cheaper for $1.50. We can mark it up 20%. Crap talker immediately jumped in. "No, let's make it 200%. This guy has no idea what he's doing. He can afford it." They argued back and forth, but crap talkers pricing won out. It was hilarious and honestly enlightening for me to listen in on. Again, I pretended I had no idea what they were saying. They ended up throwing a ridiculously high cost at me. We went through the numbers and finished the meeting. As we walked through the factory toward the parking lot, I was making idle chit-chat with the saleswoman. She asked me where I was from. "Canada," I said. She looked surprised and started asking questions about Canadians. I replied, "Well, Canadians have a stereotype of being very polite. For example," and in mid-sentence, I switched to Mandarin and said, "We usually do not say bad things about people in front of them." The saleswoman froze, looking like she was having a stroke. Crap talker's face went completely white. You could practically hear everyone's jaws hit the floor. The whole team was staring daggers at him. I started laughing my buns off and walked out of the factory. Not only had they inadvertently told me who the best manufacturer was, but these A-clowns had also spilled their competitor's lowest price. I drove to my next meeting, hit it off immediately with their competitor, and negotiated a much lower cost than I had expected, actually lower than the $1.50 the first manufacturer would have been paying. I gained an excellent manufacturing partner, saved a ton of money, and got an amazing story out of it. Needless to say, that day was a complete roller coaster. Story 7. I was down in Cuba. We arrived at the hotel, checked in, and headed to our room to drop off our things before rushing to the beach. It was around 3:45 in the afternoon local time, and I wanted to make the most of my first day in the sun. In our hurry, my wife and I forgot to put our phones in the safe. When we returned to the room, my phone was gone. I immediately went to the front desk and asked if anyone had accessed the room after we checked in. "Nope," they replied. "We would see it on our system." I went back to the room and checked again, certain I had it. I had called home to let them know I had arrived safely and that the weather was great. My wife's phone was exactly where we left it. But mine was gone. I used her phone to call mine, and all I got was a click. Back at the front desk, I asked to speak with a manager. After waiting a bit, I was directed to his office. There, the hotel manager and the head of security listened to my questions and repeated the original response. No one had entered the room, and I must have misplaced it somewhere. As I sat there, they began speaking to each other in Spanish. I caught snippets. "This guy's an idiot. He doesn't know where he put his stuff. I am not wasting my time looking for it for him," I responded. "Making fun of your clients while they're sitting right in front of you is one of the stupidest things I've ever witnessed. At a 5-star resort, I would have expected far better. Once I get home, I will be contacting the hotel chain directly to raise my concerns about the treatment I just received." The look on their faces was priceless. "Sir, we are sorry. It's just that we deal with so many drunk people who lose their stuff, and we can split ourselves looking for every lost article, or the hotel would become severely understaffed, they explained. I replied, that would have been an acceptable answer, just not calling me an idiot while I sat here. The manager then offered my wife and me a private dinner on the beach. Accepting my phone's fate, I decided to take them up on the offer and figured at least something good could come of this. The dinner turned out to be wonderful. When we returned to the room, we found a giant fruit basket, 2 bottles of champagne, and wouldn't you know it, my phone. They claimed the cleaning lady who delivered the basket had found it under the bed. Looking through the phone, I saw all sorts of calls and pictures of the staff in what I assume were employee-only areas of the hotel. She probably couldn't figure out how to change the language and didn't know how to delete the photos or call logs. I returned to the front desk and said, "Thank you for your kind gesture, but please do not continue to lie to me." Visibly upset, the manager asked why I would accuse them of lying. I showed him the note claiming the phone had been found under my bed, then the call logs, and then the photos. I said something like, "It's kind of awkward that my phone would randomly call Cuban numbers and snap pictures of the staff in uniform, all on its own from under my bed." He apologized again and gave me a travel voucher for the hotel that I could use for anything, including excursions. Thanks to their carelessness, I ended up going scuba diving and horseback riding. I guess all's well that ends well. Personally, I never used that hotel chain again. Story 8. Not the nicest of stories. I was working a retail job in a mall, and one day there was this girl who didn't want to take out the trash, thinking it was beneath her. Instead of just sitting around and waiting for her to do it, I grabbed some of the boxes and went out with her to get the job done. The trash for this store was located under the building, and to get there, you had to take a service elevator. Since it was a service elevator, all the switches and knobs were exposed. Being bored with the slow speed of the elevator, I would compulsively flick the fan switch on and off, something I did every time I rode with multiple people. No one had ever said anything about it. This girl, however, thought I had stopped the elevator entirely and was cornering her. In hindsight, I can see how she could perceive that, especially if she ignored the fact that we were moving, the doors opened when we stopped, and I did the exact same thing on the way back up. When we got up to the store, she went to the assistant manager and started talking to her in Spanish. Not a big deal. I thought it happened a lot, especially in the area I was in, which had a large Hispanic population near the farms. This manager, however, didn't like me. She saw me as a threat to her job. She had been hired as an associate when the store first opened, and I had transferred from another location when this one opened. I had seniority, which apparently made her nervous. She assumed I wanted her job, even though I was a full-time student, couldn't work the hours needed to be a manager, fully supported her promotion, and would sooner castrate myself than work in retail management. No one said anything to me about this until we got to the bank drop-off for the day's tills. The assistant manager got an inch from my face and rattled off a long string of Spanish, clearly directed at me because she assumed I couldn't understand it. The kicker: I did understand. I just needed her to speak slowly enough to catch the gist. Calmly, I responded. "What about an elevator?" She froze like a deer in headlights and quickly walked away. Of course, turning the fan off is something I compulsively do, so I wasn't even connecting what she was saying to anything that had happened. A few days later, I arrived for my next shift, and the store manager called me to the back. She explained everything that had happened, including how the father of this girl had come in the next day on a rampage through the store. Had I been scheduled that day, I would have been in serious danger. For the rest of my time at that store, there was a lingering fear that some giant man might walk in and harm me when I wasn't looking. Of course, nothing happened to the assistant manager. If she had done her job and acted professionally, she could have heard my side of the story, and I might have even had a chance to apologize for the misunderstanding. Nope, she had to be a catty little bish, try to get me fired, and possibly put my life in danger, but somehow got off scot-free. Seems about right. Fun times. Story 9. A few years back, my wife and I were on an elevator in Myrtle Beach, heading up to our hotel room. Her friend came along, a pretty blonde girl with all the assets that a typical run-of-the-mill horn dog guy tends to notice. Anyway, 3 Latino men, probably in their early 20s, hopped on the elevator. We were all in our bathing suits, so it was pretty easy for them to get a good look at the luggage my wife and her friend were packing. My wife, who's well-endowed top and bottom, immediately started hugging my side when she noticed the young men gawking at her chest. Her friend, on the other hand, didn't care at all. She's a lesbian and doesn't mind people looking. They moved to the back of the elevator and started speaking in Spanish about the blonde girl, commenting on how well-endowed she was. One of them even said he wouldn't mind burying his face in my wife's chest. The third kept going on about how, even though he had a girlfriend, he wanted to ask the blonde which one of them she'd want to have a go with. I look like your average stereotypical redneck, not the full-blown, heavy-set, cornbread-fed kind, but enough that people assume I only speak redneck English and profanity. In reality, I learned Spanish as a second language starting around age 5, and I am very fluent. It really comes in handy because I work in an ER and have many Spanish-speaking patients who can't speak English. Anyway, back to the story. I am just sitting there listening, and when I heard the third one say the "who would she rather have a go with" line, all I could do was chuckle quietly. My wife whispered, "What did they say?" I just held up a finger and said, "1 second." I turned to the third guy and said, in Spanish, of course, "I am sure she'd love for you to just ask her in English so she can not only turn you down, but your buddies too. Now, how about you stop thinking nobody understands what you're saying and stop looking at these ladies like pieces of meat before this one, pointing at the blonde, decides she's going to pound you once I tell her these very pleasant things you've just said." Boy, talk about eyes as big as half-dollar coins. All they could say was that they were sorry. They didn't know any of us spoke Spanish, or else they would have waited until they got back to their room to talk about it, since it was just meaningless locker room banter, which I completely understood. I guess I really opened up their world to the idea that looks and skin color don't dictate what languages someone knows. They were shocked to realize that this 6'1" redneck with a camo hat, a fishhook, a huge dip-in, and a Blake Shelton concert shirt could most definitely speak another language besides American. There have been plenty of situations like this, especially at work with strung-out patients or people who assume I am an ignorant redneck. They try to belittle me or make fun of me for all sorts of reasons. But this one? It's probably in my top 5 favorites. Story 10. My wife was the one who understood, not me, but this happened when we were buying our first house. We were moving from an apartment to a townhouse, or whatever your area calls them, 4 or 5 houses connected side by side, not on top of each other. At the time, we weren't using a realtor. Instead, we were using a service called Grapevine, which allowed owners to sell directly. The company handled many of the typical realtor services if you paid a fee, but it was flat, no commission involved. We ended up seeing one particularly nice place while browsing Sunday open house showings with my in-laws in tow. My mother-in-law had spent much of her career doing paperwork in a law office, much of it related to real estate and land cases. We decided we liked this house and wanted to put in an offer. According to the seller's information kit, there was an established procedure for doing this via Grapevine. If you didn't have a realtor, you needed a lawyer, and the following form had to be drafted and presented to the homeowners. They could call the company if they didn't understand any particulars. Once everything was agreed upon, the company would handle filing the paperwork. We basically just had to negotiate the price and any inclusions. We picked up the paperwork and went the next morning to a lawyer's office. Our friends had used them for their real estate purchases under the same grapevine concept and drafted the initial offer. That evening, we met with the homeowners to present it. They asked for a few minutes to look it over before getting back to us, but said, "In the meantime, why not go look around the place a bit?" All of this had been in English, and we hadn't indicated that we spoke French. The homeowners' names were something like Marc and Veronique, and they had obvious French first accents. We went upstairs, and my wife told me to walk around slowly but not to talk to her. She stood in the doorway to each room, still in the hallway, listening to the couple discuss the entire reason they were selling. They went over why the wife thought the husband was out of his mind for some of his reasons to change or reject things, and basically said, "We just need to sell this house so we can finish your stupid dream house you got us into building before the baby arrives." They talked about what they would accept if we countered on anything, where their absolute lines were, and if we crossed these, it was an immediate no. A few minutes later, we came back downstairs, sat at the table, and heard their counteroffer. My wife smiled and made a few suggestions a little above their bottom line, so as not to be completely transparent. She poked around the safe areas and managed to knock a decent chunk off the price. When we had signed everything, my wife smiled and said something like, "Congratulations on the pregnancy and the dream house," as we were leaving. It hit them immediately that she had fully understood what they were saying and already knew before we even spoke what their bottom lines were. We had signed every necessary document and were out the door before she revealed her understanding. Story 11. I avoided having to go to the police station because I knew Arabic, and my friend happened to be friends with a sheikh. I lived in the UAE from age 6 to 19. When we moved there, my mom hired tutors to help us learn Arabic, but after I turned 10 or 11, I stopped studying. I was far from fluent. One night, around 3 a.m., when I was 15, my friend, let's call her Alice, and I were talking on the phone with a guy, let's call him Omar, while Alice was sleeping over at my house. Somehow, we decided that Omar would pick us up about a mile from our house and we would all go to Burger King. Of course, Omar couldn't drive himself, but no worries. He had a driver who doubled as a private taxi. Since giving directions in our city was tricky, we agreed on a familiar landmark about a mile away as the meeting point. Now, obviously, we had to sneak out of the house to do this, which involved climbing over some patio walls, if I remember correctly. Once we were out, we started making our way. Most of the city is made up of large blocks, roughly a mile square, with smaller roads and homes weaving through. We crossed into the next block without incident, but as we were making our way to the other side, where we planned to meet Omar, we noticed a car driving slowly behind us. Guys in this city can be a bit creepy, though usually harmless, so we ducked into some alleys between homes, trying to lose them. When we reached the far side of the block, we realized we were still being followed, so we ducked into some bushes. From there, we noticed a car parked on the road nearby, and we could hear someone communicating over a radio. Something definitely seemed off. When Omar finally arrived, we jumped into the car and urged the driver to leave as quickly as possible. But just a few seconds later, we were pulled over by the CID. Kind of like the CIA, but they handle law enforcement type operations. Omar knew Arabic, so he started talking to them. The officers said we weren't allowed to be out late without ID. In Arabic, Omar made up a story about our parents being out of town and how we needed to get something from Alice's house. Honestly, I don't remember all the details. It was probably a pretty silly excuse. After Omar finished, the officer turned to me for my side of the story. By this point, Alice was crying. Since I understood Arabic well and the officer didn't know it, I was able to repeat the exact same fabricated story Omar had told, keeping everything consistent. By the time all that went down, Omar had called in his wasta, basically clout, and the sheikh arrived. With a few words, The CID was told to take a chill pill, and we all went our separate ways. After that, we headed to Burger King, and later Omar's brother drove us home. So yeah, knowing Arabic probably wasn't the crucial factor in getting out of trouble, but I still felt devious as heck repeating the exact same made-up story to a CID officer. Note, some of these might not make perfect sense depending on local customs and geography, but that's the gist of it. Story 12. I am half Chinese and half Korean, but I was born in the United States. Growing up, older generations of my ethnicity, who were not blood-related to me, often assumed I had no knowledge of Cantonese or Korean. Cantonese-speaking elders in particular tended to assume I couldn't speak any Cantonese simply because I was born in the States. These two stories happened during my childhood. The first story happened when I was at a party with my father's side of the family, just chatting with my stepsister. My mother was talking to one of my grandaunts, whom I had never met. The aunt began ranting about how uncultured and unruly the younger generation is. No respect for elders, no respect for their culture, lack of interest in embracing the culture, and the inability to speak their language, referring to both Cantonese and Korean. For context, she spoke Cantonese throughout the rant. My mom suggested that maybe she shouldn't say all that in front of the kids. The aunt replied not to worry, claiming that we Juxings, which means American-born Chinese, couldn't understand them because we didn't speak their language. I gave her a serious look and said, "Who told you I couldn't speak Chinese? Don't be so ignorant, you fossil." She looked shocked and walked away. Maybe 5 to 10 minutes later, she started talking to my aunt in Korean. The conversation was basically the same as what my grandaunt had been having with my mom. Amusingly, the aunt she was talking to was the one who had taught me Korean growing up. My aunt made it clear that I spoke fairly fluent Korean for someone my age who was juggling 3 languages. My grandaunt expressed doubt and continued trash-talking us. I tried as hard as a 15-year-old to hold it in, but it got to the point where she was outright harassing me. So in fluent Korean, I told her I couldn't wait for the day she died so I could defecate on her grave. She got upset and left the party shortly afterward. I was a rather spiteful kid growing up. On a lighter note, another story involves my grandma on my mother's side, who spoke Cantonese in me at an Asian supermarket buying tofu and raw meat. I was maybe 7 or 8 at the time. At the checkout, there was a man in his mid-20s, African-American, with a huge number of items on the register. My grandma got annoyed and started speaking to me in Cantonese. She said something along the lines of, "Oh, why are there black people in our Asian supermarkets? They don't have anything to buy here. They should leave." The African-American man turned around, stared at her, and said in fluent Cantonese, "What's wrong with being black? I have just as many rights shopping here as you." I started crying and laughing at the same time. My grandmother realized her mistake and apologized repeatedly. For context, in Cantonese, people often refer to non-Chinese individuals by their skin color. Bak Guai refers to Caucasians or people with lighter complexions, meaning white devil, white monster, or white ghost. Hak Kwai refers to African Americans or people with darker complexions, meaning black devil, black monster, or black ghost. Story 13. Oh boy, I have plenty of stories. I am half Japanese and half white. I grew up in Hawaii but moved to Japan as an adult. Because of that, I speak English, Japanese, and Hawaiian Creole. Being biracial can be frustrating because outside of Hawaii, where nearly everyone has mixed ancestry, people from both sides tend to other me. White people often do not realize I am white and sometimes assume I am fully Japanese. Japanese people, on the other hand, often assume I am fully white. My most frustrating experience in America was when I volunteered at a water sports day for middle school kids from Japan. None of the other volunteers spoke any Japanese, so they quickly became frustrated, even though the kids were very sweet and tried their best to follow instructions. Throughout the day, every single volunteer mistook me for one of the Japanese middle schoolers and assumed I could not speak English. I was 20 years old at the time. They yelled, "No, you no do that," like this, while grabbing my arm and dragging me off a kayak or snatching my snorkeling mask as the kids watched in horror. Me, "I am sorry. Was I doing something wrong?" Them, blushing in embarrassment, "Oh, I am sorry. I thought you were one of them." Me, "Haha. Whoops. Thinking, oh, but it is fine for you to treat middle schoolers like that. Jerk." So far, I have never heard a Japanese person speak badly about me, though to be fair, my Japanese still is not very good. Most of the time, they just assume I cannot speak it and switch to their best English when we talk, but since many are not very fluent, they get a bit anxious. Often, when I meet a girl, she will greet me sweetly in halting English, then turn to her coworkers or friends and say in Japanese, "Nissan needs us to speak English, okay?" Nissan means miss, but literally translates to big sister, which I find really cute. The others often respond in Japanese, "Oh dear, I'll try, but it is difficult." I am embarrassed. I have to try hard not to laugh, because they would be even more embarrassed if they knew I understood what they said. Once I start casually chatting with them in Japanese, they are usually quite amazed and delighted. My younger siblings inherited the Caucasian traits much more than I did, and unfortunately, the other locals in Hawaii sometimes give them a hard time. There is quite a bit of racism against white people in Hawaii. Locals often assume my family is from the mainland United States and cannot speak Hawaii Creole, so they start talking badly right in front of them. One time I was sitting on the beach, and my sister was sitting quietly a little farther down. Suddenly, she turned to some local boys and started yelling at them in the most furious, machine gun speed Creole I had ever heard her use. A rough translation of what she yelled would be, "Whoa! What the hell is wrong with you?" followed by a tirade about how they were disgracing their family honor, the kind of speech that would have made even Milan blush. She is usually very laid back, so I was shocked until she explained that the boys had been planning to bully and hurt our little brother to teach these freaking white a-holes a lesson. Another time, a group of local girls cornered her and tried to provoke a fight until she started speaking Creole back to them. They were so surprised that they backed off and left her alone. Story 14. I flew to Egypt and arrived in Alexandria. Egyptair lost my luggage, along with that of more than 20 other people, around 40 pieces in total. This is where the trouble began. Generally, Egyptian employees tend to treat foreigners with more respect. Knowing this, and since I do not look Egyptian, I avoided using any Egyptian Arabic words. I spoke only English and pretended to be a foreigner, even though I am partly Egyptian and partly Northern European. The Egyptair representative told everyone to return in the morning, as the next flight would arrive then. The transit was in Cairo, and it seemed likely that our luggage had been left there. Egyptair offered no assistance, no refund, no delivery to our addresses, nothing. Somehow, someone in Cairo bribed their way to have more than 20 large pieces of luggage flown over instead of ours. Corruption in Egypt, the airport, and Egyptair hardly a surprise. I knew I was eligible for a refund, so I told him in English that I wanted one. The representative asked me to wait a moment and managed to send half the people home, promising their luggage would be there when they returned in the morning. Then he called me aside and said I was eligible for a small refund. I agreed, but told him I would still wait there for further solutions. He said I was free to do whatever I thought was best and went off to prepare the refund documents. Knowing that he had deliberately withheld information about the refund from the Egyptian travelers, I went to others who had lost their luggage and told them I had received one. They got angry, confronted the representative, and argued about discrimination. They demanded the same treatment I had received, and the representative, faced with their anger, gave them the refund as well. We are talking about $20 per person. I also requested that my luggage be delivered to my address for free once it arrived. They told me this was only possible at Cairo Airport and impossible in Alexandria due to security concerns, which I called nonsense. They led me to the airport's security manager, and I brought some of the Egyptians with me to argue that we should be allowed to receive our luggage at our addresses instead of returning to the airport. Going back and forth to the airport costs $40 by taxi. The security manager heard the story from the representative, but didn't speak to me because he didn't know English. He literally told the representative in front of the Egyptians that my luggage could be sent to my address because I am a foreigner, while the others had to wait at the airport or return later because they are Egyptians. That's when all hell broke loose. The Egyptians were shocked and began arguing with him, but in the end, they got nowhere and were sent out of his office. In the end, I waited for my luggage at the airport alongside the Egyptians. I got my refund, confirmed that some Egyptian government employees and bureaucrats can be discriminatory, and even made a few new friends. I also have another story from Egypt, but maybe I'll save that for another post. Story 15. For this story, my partner's name is Tori. During summer break from her small East Coast liberal arts college, we lived together back on the West Coast, where we're both from. The small liberal arts part is important. Keep that in mind. One morning, after a long night out with friends, we headed to the park to nurse our hangovers. It was a beautiful day, and we spent hours just lying there doing a whole lot of nothing until Zio showed up. Tori's friend Nicole had invited V, an old friend from their raving days. V is a round-faced Afghani man in his mid-30s, impeccably groomed, with greasy, slicked-back hair. His cousin from Afghanistan comes along, and it's clear the cousin doesn't speak much English. Being Persian myself, I am always curious about meeting another Middle Easterner, but I immediately feel uneasy around V. Before he arrived, Tori and Nicole were reminiscing about how kooky and funny he was back in the day. But when he walks up, he introduces himself as if he's never met either of them. I can't help but feel put off by him. His snake-like green eyes have a sharp, caustic look, and his body language feels off, almost patronizing. Strangely, he acts as if he doesn't know Tori at all. Then I start talking, and he asks if I know Farsi, which I do. I still pretend I don't. I love Farsi, but with a massive hangover, and his Afghani Farsi, whose tone almost sounds like Arabic, I am in no condition to have a conversation in anything other than sleep. As soon as I say no, V turns to his cousin and starts speaking Farsi, and this is where things get really strange. Without missing a beat, V begins giving cousin a rundown on Tori and her friend Nicole. Nicole, he says, is a broken person from a broken family. Or really. For context, Nicole, the friend who invited him, had just left a physically abusive relationship after years of abuse at home. Calling her broken is an understatement, but the words he chose carried a far darker implication, suggesting she was worthless as a woman. Next, of course, comes my so. And that one, Vet says, is studying this weird kind of bilingual psychology at Hogwarts College. Yeah, she used to date my friend Lou. She's a real bish. I sit there stunned. Not only am I seriously hungover, but this guy has the audacity to act clueless while trash-talking my girlfriend and her friends. Being the only other Farsi speaker and not wanting to start a scene or, shove my Pepsi can down his throat, I have no choice but to wait until he leaves, trying to subtly hint to Tori that something is off the whole time. Eventually, Viet gets tired of us and decides he has better things to do. Just as he walks off, I turn to him and say goodbye in Farsi. To his utter amazement, suddenly, he realizes what just happened. He prances off, up the other side of the hill we were sitting on, to who knows where, and neither I nor my friends have ever seen him again. Thankfully, screw everyone who behaves like that. Screw you, V. Story 16. Not my story, but my English teacher's. I am from a Spanish-speaking country. She told the class that when she was in her early 20s, she and a friend were on a plane returning from Italy. About 2 rows ahead of them sat an allegedly gorgeous man who had spoken to the flight attendant in Italian. My teacher and her friend spent the entire flight talking endlessly about how hot he was. Of course, since they were speaking in English and the man was clearly Italian, they didn't bother being discreet and talked rather loudly. At the end of the flight, he unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed his bags, and looked my teacher straight in the eye. In perfect English, he said, "You know, you're not the only ones who speak English," grinned and got off the plane. Needless to say, my teacher was very insistent that we always be mindful of what we say, even when we think no one can understand. Story 17. We did this, but fortunately, it wasn't mean-spirited. My husband is American-born and raised, but he grew up speaking German with his family. He wanted our kids to be bilingual, so he speaks only German with them. My kids and I were at Chincoteague Island in Virginia, a popular vacation spot for many Amish families. We were standing in line at an ice cream parlor behind a group of about 20 Amish people, including 7 or 8 teenage girls. My daughter, who is used to speaking German to me like it's a secret code, said, "Look at what they're wearing, the dresses and bonnets, and look at their hair, so thick and shiny. They all look pretty." The girls all turned at once and looked at her in surprise, which startled her. I told her, "They clearly understood everything you just said." She looked embarrassed, then shrugged, and replied that she hadn't said anything she wouldn't have said to their faces. It was still a new experience for her. Story 18. For a school assignment, I had to shadow a Hawaiian tattoo artist. He was old school, still using turtle shells and tapping the ink into the skin. He and his apprentice spoke to each other in Hawaiian, often mentioning me and the other shadowee. Hawaiian speakers are rare, so I didn't blame him for assuming we couldn't understand. We asked questions and wrote down the answers, and at one point I asked him a question in Hawaiian. He and the apprentice didn't stop tattooing, but they exchanged a very subtle "oh poop" look and then said in Hawaiian, "We gotta watch what we say now." Ha ha. They were good guys, but it was definitely a lesson learned. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.